Right. So, it seems that we are at the top of the hour. So I feel like we have many, many, many apples to bite. I feel like that's an appropriate work well analogy. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started as we um, allow others to join into the session. They can join us en route, but I do want to talk about a few important matters before we got to dive right into our subject matter today. So I'd like to thank each and every one of you for joining today's session. My name is Carbe. I am the program director for WorkWell NYC, and we think it is really important for city employees to begin to have dialogues and conversations about matters and issues and topics that affect them both in and outside of work. And this is what kind of sparked this discussion today, a conversation that matters. And no one could deny or be immune to what is happening both locally and nationally in terms of response to racism and acts of bias and discrimination. And it impacts us all, both in the work we do and how we interact in our communities, how we engage with one another. And so we just want to have some very informal roundtable conversations about what those experiences are, how do we respond to them, and most importantly, how do we move this conversation forward, and what do we do to help change this narrative to one that is much more cooperative and progressive, and that enables us to kind of build the futures that we all see for ourselves. So I want to just say that there is no production without a team of people helping to work and coordinate these sessions for you all. And so I'd just like to give a quick acknowledgement to Victoria and Priya, who are members of the WorkWell team working behind the scenes to capture all of your questions and be responsive to them and help coordinate our panelists today. Thank you so very much. A little bit about WorkWell. For those who've been here before, you know all about us. But for those who may have forgotten or who this is your first session, WorkWell NYC is the city's workplace wellness initiative. And we have 5 tiers of programming in which we work through, including physical activity, keeping that body right, and healthy eating, thinking about what we eat and how we nourish ourselves. Primary care prevention, so how do we prevent disease, and if we have it, how do we develop more manageable behaviors and practices so that we could have healthier lives. Mental well-being and resilience, what we partner with Thrive NYC on to really think about how do we have sound body and sound mind, and our newest initiative, Project Build, which is really around health equity, because we all know that health is not distributed in fair amounts. And based on today's conversation too, race has a definite important role to play in how health is distributed and consumed in our communities. So we're looking forward to building that. Just a key flag, we do lots of things. Health is concentric and there's no isolation, even though we've divided it into buckets. And so if you want to keep up with us and everything that we do, I want to encourage you to join our mailing list. No need to source and find where things are happening and how can you do that. Encourage others. As participants today, we'll go ahead and add you to the mailing list, but if there are others who are interested in these discussions and joining, you can direct them to this URL. And this is mostly going to be a conversation with our panelists today, but tomorrow we want to hear from you. We want to understand what your thoughts are and how you see things through your lens and how you can add to this conversation. So we're having a feedback and community forum tomorrow at 5 p.m. Please go ahead and register. You can find this link on our upcoming events page. So any questions you have for our panelists or anything you want to ask us or add to really make this conversation richer and more expansive, and how we build our community, the New York City community, to really be that place of the future where everyone is treated in the manner in which they deserve, they respect, and they are valued. So please join us tomorrow just to be able to be heard and to sound off. Your mics are muted because we won't be taking conversations today. That is held for tomorrow, which I just explained, but we will be collecting questions and answers. So if there are key questions or something that came up or something that you want to address, please go ahead and put in the chat box. As I mentioned, our Teamwork Well is capturing all of those things, and we want to make sure that we're able to process it in due fashion, or either bring it to our forum tomorrow, where we'll be having this kind of open discussion with our community. And today's session will be recorded, and if you registered, which is how you got here, you will receive a copy of the recording. And anybody else who would like to see it, who wasn't able to participate, you can share that copy as well. So this month, the CDC, I'm a little late, but late is better than never, declared racism a serious public health threat and outlined steps it would take to address it. The CDC is now one of many health organizations that has published public statements about the impact that racism has on health, including the American Public Health Association and more than 170 other local and state leaders about its impact on health. And even our very own New York City Health Commissioner just recently last week, in response to the Chonavin trial verdict, talked about, the grief and fear that Black, Indigenous, and people of color experience due to racism in this country must be addressed so that all Americans have a healthy future free of harm and trauma. So there is really no denial about the connections to one's own well-being and how they experience themselves in the city and the state and this country through a lens of race and who has and who doesn't. And so we really want to talk about these experiences in very real time and provide an opportunity to create pathways to next steps. And so what I want to do from you is, for the attendees who have joined today, I want to understand who's in the room. So we have a poll that we're going to launch, hopefully that will pop up, and let us know, have you ever experienced an incident of bias or discrimination or racism in the workplace? So go ahead. If no one knows who you are, please, feel free to be honest and tell us what has been your experiences, because our panelists today will share theirs. All right. So we are logging them in, and we got most of the room in. So I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. And we have about 60% of you who said yes, they have experienced this, which is a common experience these days if you can flag it and you can identify it. And I'm very curious about the 17% who is unsure. And I think that kind of speaks to why we're having this discussion today. So what is bias, what is discrimination, what is racism, and what do you do about it? So I wanna thank you for sharing your experiences in that, and it helps us, lets us know, who we got around the table with us. And with that, I'd like to introduce today's panelists. We have 4 dynamic panelists from our city agencies who are really going to talk through some of these discussions. And so first we have Rebecca Zhang. She is a public health program assistant at New York City Office Chief Medical Examiner Office, where she works to deliver wellness programs, initiatives for the almost 700 OCME employees. We have Jamila quashi. Oh, no, we have Alicia Miranda, who hers. She serves as a program manager for the Office of Prevention and Hate Crimes. Previously, she worked at ACS, overseeing prevention programming against violence and sexual exploitation of children. And prior to this, she worked for the Kings County District Attorney's Office Victim Service Unit as an advocate assigned with the Civil Rights Bureau Hate Crimes Unit. Thank you for joining us today, Alicia and Rebecca. We also have Jamila quashi. She is the Director of Health and Safety at the New York City Office of Chief Medical Examiner, where she oversees all matters related to health and safety programs, policies, and procedures. Jamila is also a staunch advocate for wellness and leads several initiatives as a Workable NYC ambassador, and also serves as an adjunct professor at the City University of New York and co-chairs the OCME Wellness Committee for over 700 employees. Thank you for joining us today. And finally, we have Eunice Lee, who serves as program manager for the Office of Prevention and Hate Crimes. She previously worked at the New York City Office of Inspector General for the NYPD as a crime victim advocate in Safe Horizons Crime Victim Assistance Program. She also provides academic professional development and generalized reentry services for youth with previous justice involvement at Center for Alternative Sentencing and Employment Services. So certainly our panelist has a very wide and far-reaching grasp of experience really to weigh in on our presenting questions. So today we're talking all about racism. And a quick definition, I mean, this is a loaded word in conversation, but how we're going to define it today: the systemic oppression of a racial group to the social, economic, and political advantage of another. So I want to turn it over right away to my panelists and just talk about what has been your experiences in racism and how does it show up? And we're going to launch that particularly around the first topic, which is internalized racism, like the acceptance by marginalized racial populations of negative societal beliefs and stereotypes about themselves. So I'm going to open up the floor. Who would like to help me weigh in? What has been your experiences here?
Why you have I guess I can give an example of what I experienced. So the racism I experienced was very subtle and seemingly innocuous. A superior called me into a meeting to address something I believe didn't affect me. But the issue made the superior staff look incompetent. But instead of addressing that problem, I was criticized, stripped of responsibilities, and asked to be a secretary while the others were not challenged or disciplined. I was the most qualified person in the room and the only minority. So the only thing I could think of was it was just a subtle example of a racist act.
And how about others around the table? What have been your experiences here? So there was some of the, Jamila talked about this subtleness. Other experiences?
I could talk about a more, or what I perceive as a more explicit experience of racism. A few weeks ago, I was walking home alone at night. I had my AirPods in and I was just minding my business, trying to get home. Then a car slowly pulls up next to me. The driver rolls down his window and he yells a racial slur and drives off. And this probably happened within a span of seconds, but I remember in that exact moment fearing for my life, and I didn't scream back. I just kept quietly walking, and I made it home that night, and I didn't tell anyone, not my parents, not my boyfriend, not my friends, because I didn't want them to worry about me. And it wasn't until very recently that I opened up about this and told my family what happened.
Yeah, so it's sort of like, that internalization, like, don't worry about me, I'll be okay. And then it's sort of, but how do you process this and what had been going on? So absolutely, absolutely. Other experiences around the table.
Yes, this is Eunice from the Office for the Prevention of Hate Crimes. So first, thank you for sharing those two experiences. I think I definitely relate on several levels. I think just to start with something in the workplace, which is kind of the topic that we're discussing, definitely experienced many more explicit, but also these subtle, like nuanced experiences. And I think one was noticing that a few of my bosses had always, even if I was the lead of a project, directed their questions or directed their comments at someone else in the room that had maybe more power in relation to me, even though I was technically leading this project, right? And I noticed this and I was like, am I mistaken? Is it some other reason? Am I not doing a good job? And kind of internalizing all these things and doubts about myself and even my competence. And then noticing that this was actually a trend, even with other colleagues of mine, noticing that they always pretty much directed these comments and questions to people with higher up in the power dynamic, let's say. So that is something that I've definitely noticed throughout the years and been impacted by. And I think also something that I've observed and been impacted by is just like this generational trauma that comes with racism. So this is a story that I share, but it happened to my mom who had immigrated in the 80s. And she had taken the subway and been attacked for being Asian. And she told this to me very early on in my life. And basically she would never let me take the train line that she was attacked on. And I think this just speaks to really how powerful these experiences are. It was definitely lasting in her memory. I wasn't even there. I wasn't even born at that time. But that also was passed down to me, and is something that to this day, I take the subway line and like looking back over my shoulder, and I definitely feel the weight of anxiety and fear that she had experienced at that time. So that's something that I just also wanted to throw out there as an example.
Wow, yeah, great point. I mean, the generational, how we pass this down generationally, your mother fearing for your safety, yeah, powerful examples, powerful. And Alicia, how about you? Anything you want to share about your experiences, and particularly in the workplace around racism or bias, discrimination?
I mean, I will say for me personally, I can't say that I've experienced racism, but rather discrimination. I think I look a bit more racially ambiguous. So depending on what neighborhood I'm in, what I'm wearing, etc., I've been mistaken for many different identities. That is probably before you hear my accent, and more than likely know that I'm a Latina from New York City. So I do want to, give some space to the other panelists on this particular question.
Awesome. So when those happen, I think we talked about interpersonal racism, and I think I'll circle back to Jamila's example about being asked to be the recording secretary for meetings or for a group that she was obviously leading, or even Eunice's example, they mirror very similarly. When this happens, discriminations between individuals and their institutional roles, well, what is that experience like in that moment, how are you processing it? Like, what do you do? I think it's easy, after the, hindsight is always 2020, but kind of in that moment, like, what is the experience, and what are you thinking about in terms of how you're processing those engagements, those interactions?
So for me, I know I felt confused. You don't want to respond with anger, because there's also another connotation that goes with that. You don't want to make the situation worse. And it also depends on the environment that you're in. Like, who do you address it directly? Who is the person? Do you go above them? And then also just dealing with the anxiety that you're experiencing at that moment in time. It's very confusing. I know a lot of people who I've spoken to don't know what to do. Do you go to HR? What is the repercussion for it? It's very confusing.
And how about you, Eunice, in your example? How is that, interpersonal? Because this happens between two people. Like, that's typically how it happens, or a group of people. And in that moment when you were being looked over or looked through as not as the official leader in that capacity, like, what was that experience like, that feeling like?
Yeah, it was also very confusing. I think these just take you by surprise in a certain way. Not that this is surprising at all, but not sure how to process it, who I could process with. I wasn't sure, like, I think finding safe spaces within your workplaces are very important, like people that can understand you, can support you. And I was very new to that workplace and very new to my career. And I didn't want to make waves or be like a problem, and I'd also doubted myself in that instance before I even questioned the scenario and the circumstances. So I think my first reaction was definitely like confusion. I felt very hurt, and it was a lot of doubt, I think, of myself. And I think that's also because of the ways that I had internalized my role in things, who I was, my competence throughout the years. So I know that someone had asked a question about how I resolved it. I didn't resolve it. I thought it was better to keep observing, like building up evidence to confirm to myself that this was happening. And I think looking back on it later, now I realized, and I could name it for what it was. But back then I was like, am I making this up? Is this my own fault? I think that was really difficult.
And I think that's challenging. Certainly, those incidences in the workplace are challenging, particularly if you're confused and you're not really sure where the safe spaces are. And if we go back to Rebecca's example, like someone she didn't even know, like random person from the street, like, and you mentioned, Rebecca, that it took you a little bit of time to process and to be able to tell even your family members that this incident had happened to you. And I guess I want to explore a little bit like why wait? Like what was going through, what were your thought processes in waiting and not vocalizing, or what was that experience like for you?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question, Sakara, and how we could segue into the next question and how just we normalize racism. I just think that we tend to do this for a variety of different reasons. And I think for me especially, culture played an important role. I mean, I could only speak on the East Asian culture. I'm Korean, and in our culture, we tend to not speak up about these experiences and these grievances as to not burden others. We often feel the need to hide, these negative experiences and not share them with others because we don't want to, again, burden them with the stress or whatever. Just in our lives.
Yeah, so it's a lot of cultural frameworks there that may prevent you from that next step. Understandable. And so I think the normalization of it is also something I like to talk about in this next key term about microaggression, because I feel like that happens like every, when the big one happens, it's like hits you like a ton of bricks, like bam, like, it reverberates through you, because this really negative incident that is you are experiencing is happening for no other reason than what you look like. And so that is that reverberation goes through you. But sometimes there are these little things, these little cogwheels that build up called microaggressions. And we're going to define them for the purposes today as, everyday, subtle yet intentional, and sometimes unintentional interactions or behaviors that communicate some sort of bias toward historically marginalized groups. So let's talk about microaggressions, because I think that could be much more of a universal experience too, because sometimes people don't even know this is the label for it. They just know that something happened and they're not sure what the label is. So let's talk a little bit about microaggressions in your experiences with these types of interactions. Maybe Alicia, you can kick us off.
All right. I think just on the how we normalize it front, we do so when we aren't naming the behavior or the action. And sometimes because of microaggressions, it's hard to even know that what we experienced was discrimination because it's usually in a subtle, maybe like a backhanded compliment type of way. Right. So I can share a personal story that, speaks to an experience I had with discrimination a few years ago. It didn't necessarily happen in the workplace, but it definitely made me more aware of my identity and how others are perceiving me. So some of my identities are not as visible as others. So for instance, I'm queer and married to a same-sex partner. I'm a cancer survivor. Not many people know that, including my colleague Eunice, who's on the call. And I need to have regular follow-ups to ensure that the cancer doesn't come back. And in one of my follow-up appointments, I brought my wife, who at the time was more feminine presenting before she had the big chop. And I remember having to explain that this is my partner, my wife, this is not my friend, so that she can be present with me for the appointment. And then I remember the nurse who was taking care of me asking us who was the boy in the relationship, because she couldn't tell. And in that moment, I was deeply offended by her ignorance, but I also felt like, that was a teachable moment, right? Mm-hmm. For her, at least, which I don't feel, is always the case. You aren't responsible to educate other people on, your identity or your experiences. That can feel, very intrusive and can easily become a traumatizing experience in of itself, if those experiences aren't being validated or you're being gaslighted. So I would only recommend that if you feel comfortable and have that relationship that you feel is worth preserving. For me, I didn't know this nurse, but I did genuinely feel that she just didn't know any better. So I did address it and confront it with her directly. And I didn't escalate it because I do feel like she just genuinely didn't know any better. Maybe she's never had a gay friend, never had a gay patient. I don't know, but I did confront it in that moment.
Well, excellent. I mean, I think that certain situations, create that opportunity, and not all situations, because not all people are willing to receive new information. But I think it was, I'm happy that that situation, ended in a way that she could, that it could be a teachable moment. But not all microaggressions end up so well. I think, for anybody who works with me, they know that I love metaphors and analogies, and I see microaggressions as this kind of dripping into the bucket, right? Drip, little by little, it drips, and it builds and it builds and it builds. And I'd love to go explore at least one or two other examples that you might have around microaggressions, so that people can begin to give a face and a name to this this thing that kind of pebble in the shoe. It starts off and then it snowballs, because then I think Eunice kind of described it best. It creates a lot of self-doubt, a lot of anxiety, a lot of discomfort, and even pain, depending on, how long it's endured. So any other experiences around microaggressions, either in or out of the workplace? Well, let's circle back. I think that this might be a conversation that I think might have some other opportunities as we move further along in the discussion. Then we have the thing about bias. And, the thing about bias is that everybody's got bias. There's no human that is immune from some type of bias. And but that doesn't make it okay. It makes it an obligation to really learn more about what your biases are. But the tricky thing about unconscious bias is that it operates outside of somebody's awareness. So there are beliefs that might not be hyper aware that somebody might be acting on, and really can really be directly contradictory to what they think they believe. Like I always, one of the examples that I shared about this is that I have a wonderful best friend whose mother, nicest person in the world, right? I used to wrap my hair like a wrap, an African wrap my hair. And she said to me, and at the time there was lots of really attacks of Muslim Americans in New York City. And she said to me, "I'm so happy you stopped doing that. Now you're safe." And it was like from the nicest place in the world. Like she didn't want to be hurt, but it was just kind of like my interpretation is like, that's not how we solve the problem. The problem is that people are being attacked for wearing religious garments a little bit. And so when we think about bias and particularly unconscious bias, implicit bias, what should we be hyper vigilant about? I think, how do we begin to respond to some of these things? I think, let's talk about the response, because I think that that's really where we lead to kind of like this different narrative, in terms of bias. People who may not be aware, I think Alicia talked about a teachable moment where she was able to build a collaboration there. But what else can we do? What else is going on here?
I think that we don't accept it. That's part of normalizing, so going back as well. But we don't accept what's going on, try to challenge it, because if we don't challenge it, it just continues, right? And of course, challenging it can sometimes cause some conflict or tension, and might damage a relationship. But then to me, acceptance is worse, because then it leads to things festering and being worse. So we just have to find a space where we feel comfortable to address and challenge these issues.
Well, how do you do that? I feel like that, to me, that's like the rubber hitting the road, like the safe pace. What if you don't have, like, you know, a supportive community? Like, you know, how do you challenge? What does challenging look like? Let's let's create like a clear picture. What does challenging look like? Some of these things.
So what I try to do is be understanding to, because the person I believe is ignorant, and just try to explain and to just appeal to their empathy. Like, you know, this is how it makes me feel, and how would you feel if I did this to you? And in most situations, that has actually helped, I think. I've actually had the relationships with people after that, but that's a way of challenging it. Just calling it out and saying like, hey, you know, that was very hurtful and this is why. It doesn't have to be like an aggressive interaction, just something more like, hey, you need to understand that you should not do this moving forward, things like that.
But just to go off of that, Alicia mentioned a really great point that sometimes you don't have to call people out. Sometimes it's not your, I mean, it's not your responsibility to teach and educate others. And especially if you don't feel comfortable doing so, or if you feel as though you don't have the agency to do so. So for myself, I consider myself lower in the workplace hierarchy. I'm a part-time program assistant for the wellness committee at OCME, and I definitely don't have the right resources or the right support group, or, you know, as I mentioned, the right agencies to sometimes speak up for myself or speak out for myself.
And so what might be some, you know, and I want to go back to something that you said, Rebecca, too, about, you know, just the cultural dynamic that exists there. So which kind of is counterintuitive to kind of, you know, what Jamila talked about is like going back to the person, kind of sharing the impact of what that behavior or that, you know, that statement made. And so what might be some other opportunities here that we can help shift what this dynamic look like in different places? So one of it is a very direct approach, and I'm going to go back, but what might be some other strategies there?
So I have a bunch of comments. I'm really enjoying the conversation, as tough as it is, and the comments in the chat. I'm like trying to pay attention to both because there's so much happening. I think for myself, I guess just in response to the original question and just seeing implicit bias that everyone experiences, that everyone has, part of my journey has really been just kind of learning and unpacking this for myself. So I know I've committed microaggressions against other people in my workplace, outside. And I think really being cognizant of that and knowing how this might show up for myself as well as for other people. And I think that was like a basic fundamental step for me, and just being able to reflect and being able to address it if it's a safe space for me and a colleague, or me and whoever else, based on that relationship of trust. I think another step is just being aware of this like kind of environment that we create with others as well. So I think in the example that I mentioned earlier about my workplace, so I had no one to really talk to about this because I was new to the workplace. And I think it would have been really amazing to have another colleague either notice what was happening and be able to process with me afterwards, check in. And I think that kind of ties into bystander, upstander principles, which is a big part of our work. And learning to really have your eyes out for people and these situations that might be happening and being ready to help that person process, to maybe intervene if that is a place and a dynamic that you have, being able to speak out against an employer potentially if you have that power dynamic as well, which is what Rebecca kind of referred to earlier. If you're in a different spot in that organization or have been there longer and know who you might be able to reach out to, I think having that person available and being that person for someone else and being ready to do that can be really important. And I think that the city has a lot of these kinds of trainings available because it's something that you can't really just jump into. It's something that really comes with like practice and thought and reflection. So I think getting that skill and really developing it can be really important into creating this like better future, which is what Sakara kind of opened this talk with. So that's something else that I wanted to.
Really important point, and I think nothing is as, I guess, as jarring as the person who is the recipient of the bias, the hate, or the discrimination. There's no, but that you could be equally as paralyzed, I think, as a bystander, if you also feel powerless, if there's a sense, if you're working in a like community where there's people who don't feel empowered to act. And so I think you're absolutely right, thinking about the bystander training that's being offered, thinking about ways to help kind of change the narrative, the conversation. And I think one of the things I really want to emphasize is that it doesn't always have to be ginormous and big. It can be incremental, but intentional, and thinking about how we change these paradigms that exist, particularly if people are not aware, and it's unintentional. And to also circle back to something that Eunice said, is really about the more we explore our own biases, and where that comes from, helps us, awaken to how we could have impact in helping bringing others along as well. So the last kind of topic in kind of defining racism, I think, is the one that we're all being kind of hit with daily. It seems like on a daily basis. Has been very long term, to be quite honest, but I think with the age or the advent of social media and a lot more kind of mobilization around this, is kind of systemic institutional racism. It's like, one isolated incident is one thing, two isolated incidents is one thing, a dozen, 100, 1,000, this is something else, right? The dynamics, are set up, I always remember this quote where somebody said, it's like, every system is designed to produce exactly what it was built for. So if we are producing laws or policies or procedures that continue to propagate matters of injustice, of racism, of disparity, we will always get that, because the system is where the power exists in many ways. And so it is a combination of many hands in. And so let's like to have just a small, kind of discussion about how each of you are kind of dealing with what's happening around us between we've had several sessions about, API hate that has been happening. There's still lots of, tension around, the challenges of George Floyd and interactions with the community around racism. And many other incidents. Before it was anti-Semitism, lots of debates around LGBTQIA plus rights and trans rights, and this is the system that somehow has been created. And just how do we exist in it, and how do we help as individuals? Like, if you're trying to take on the system, like, what's the individual experience and the individual response to that? Maybe we'll open it up. Maybe Jamila, you want to take us off? We want to kick us off.
So I do feel like I'll speak about what goes on in my agency. I do feel like there are instances where, because of how there's certain structures within here that just actually led to certain units being set up a specific way. And just dealing with what's going on in the country right now and interacting with people in those units. Like, say we have a unit that's majority minority, right? And interacting with those employees and just understanding how stressed they are, because right now a lot of us are very exhausted just dealing with the daily issues that are going on. What I try to do here, what I'm trying to do, is actually open up our management or executive staff, let them understand that, we need to be a little bit more diverse in how we are hiring people. Simple things like, what schools are you looking for when we looking to hire? Like, let's reach out to certain programs where we know we get a more diverse group. Because if you have groups within the agency that look a specific way, when they interact with each other, there are going to be tensions that it's nobody outwardly wanted to create that, but it's a systemic issue. And we can actually change things by simply being more diverse in our hiring practices. And I know that the city civil service system was really set up to be diverse, right? But even with that, within that, there's still structures that don't lead to diversity. So we have to make an extra effort by just going out and getting more people, or doing more things within that will promote people or lead them to move up certain ways. So that's my way of trying to address the systemic issues that we have in this agency.
And maybe Alicia, you want to talk about the Office of Prevention of Hate Crimes. I mean, it's very narrow in subject matter, but in order to prevent hate crimes, somehow you have to change the system which generates them. What has been that experience, both as somebody who's been trying to change it internally through a lot of your professional experiences, and now being a part of the unit, the team that has been tasked with dismantling it, and what does that look like on a day-to-day, and how do we bring that outside view inside to the work that we do ourselves?
Yeah, I think that it first starts off with the team, right? Being willing and vulnerable to engage in some of these conversations with one another. And I think the way I interpreted this conversation is like, how can we support each other in this work, right? So if you're having these experiences, I'm sure, maybe someone else within your office may also be having those experiences. And how can we create internal support systems so that we're not feeling isolated and alone? And I think part of what our office has done was inviting agencies like Oath, which is the Office for Administrative Trials and Hearings, to facilitate dialogues around experiences related to racism, discrimination, and being able to, confront our biases, and being willing to engage in that dialogue with one another, so that we're practicing awareness in our work. So I would definitely, recommend.
Let's go for a minute. Somebody put out a notice in your agency like, "Hey, everybody, come talk about racism in our agency," right? No one ever like.
Right, but I think that it requires like a willingness for people to be vulnerable. Maybe it's not like a mock J-wide, you know what I mean? But it's a small group. We're a staff of 7, right? So I think that is a more manageable conversation to have with one another. We're all of different backgrounds and intersecting identities, right? Versus inviting 50, 100 plus people to engage us in this conversation. I think it's more intimate that way, and maybe there is more of a willingness, and it usually it has to start with someone being willing to kind of break the ice in a sense, right? To engage and confront maybe experiences they had, whether they were the ones who were on the receiving end or they were the ones on the end of perpetrating it, and being able to confront that, because you can't engage in this work if you're not willing to look inward at yourself and like, how have you contributed to these things, right? And it starts with the team. You can't push and have these dialogues with community if you're not practicing those principles yourself, right? So having a willingness to like make sure that this is part of our regular conversations. And it doesn't necessarily, I encourage to explore different ways to find that support, whether it's having someone come to your team to facilitate that conversation, or looking at what systems are in place within your office. Is there a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee at your work or at your school that creates that safe and supportive space to discuss some of these heavier issues and experiences that you might be having?
It's so funny. I think one of the panelists talked about how Parks is creating subcommittees to address racism. So I think it's very much a local approach and Jamila talked about her strategies at OCME to have people engaged in maybe looking at hiring practices or offering up different perspectives to help people see the system, because sometimes the system operates invisibly. Like we just think, I think, talked about the civil service system, like, but it was created to help dismantle a lot of this, but there are holes in the system too. So sometimes that happens invisibly. And so I think to Alicia's point, making the invisible visible. But I just want to flag something, because I'm all about real-time talks. Like sometimes it's like, the city of New York is a real big place. And, no one really works for the city of New York. Everybody works for their agency. Like I work for DEP, I work for DAP. It's like, even if you work for that agency, let's say, you work for DOE, there's 100,000 people there, work for, health, there's 6,000 people here. The system can seem very large to one person trying to slay dragons in some way. I guess, what are some ways, what is the practical approach? We talked about already finding maybe a colleague, somebody you can have this kind of dialogue, but what might be some other practical things that people can do who might not have, like Rebecca talked about, the agency or the wherewithal to take on the system? Like how do we compartmentalize to take on bite-sized portions?
I'm kind of cheating because this is something that we talked about in our planning conversation, but I think I have a few responses again.
Lay it on us, Eunice.
Go back to this response. I think, okay, for first bite-sized piece, I definitely think that this can be really overwhelming. And I think the typical response to overwhelming is just like shutting down, getting paralyzed, getting jaded, cynical about like, how are we going to make this kind of change? It's pretty much remaking the world kind of thing. And I think it's very difficult to answer this kind of question. And I also think that a lot of us probably feel this conflict within us because as you see in this slide, specific laws, policies, procedures of institutions, example, the government, and we work in government. And we always feel this conflict, like I am part of an institution that has historically really perpetuated so many of these harms. How am I going to work within the government, within these systems to make it better and to redirect this trajectory? And what is my role in that? And I think part of a response personally is like, how do I prevent myself from getting overwhelmed and being paralyzed and not knowing what to do and just getting stuck? And I think part of what Jamila said about leadership, really directing that effort. And I think what Alicia was also saying about like looking internally to the team. There are these different levels. And again, I'm going to the individual level and kind of thinking about resilience and building and making sure that you're okay throughout all of this. And staying empowered and staying positive and hopeful throughout this whole process. And I think one very tangible thing is self-care and really finding your people in your workplace, outside the workplace, if the workplace has none of those people potentially, and really making sure that you are paying attention to yourself physically and mentally, and making sure that you can run this race to the end of it, because this is not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen in a month, let's be real. And really staying engaged and talking with these people, talking through the process. What can we do? What is this policy that maybe I can bring to work? How can I do that? How can I huddle with my team and see what kind of change that we can make this year, this month as like a goal? I think that kind of process can be really important. And of course, making sure that you're going to be okay and healthy throughout all of that is also going to be really foundational to be able to accomplish it once you set that objective or goal. So that is my cheating kind of answer, but that's just something I wanted to share.
Absolutely. I think sometimes you get tired. Like, I work with EAP a lot, and so I think there was some mention of EAP in the chat. Definitely a great resource to turn to when you need that bit of self-care. You feel like these things have been, really overwhelming for you, and it's just like one of Claire Colorado, was a deputy director there, talked about. Give me this vocabulary term that it was resonated so much with me about learned helplessness, and how sometimes, when things get so overwhelming, you just say, well, it's never going to be different. Like, they're never going to change their mind. It's always been like this. Why would anything be different? And I think sometimes over time, in institutions as large as something like the ones that we work in, change can happen very slowly at times. And so it's hard sometimes to even see. And I think, Eunice, you bring up a great point about perseverance, and in that perseverance of doing what you can, taking the opportunities to self-care, because the journey can be very long, and sometimes not as quick, I think, as they ought to be and should be based on what the content is of it, So I just wanted to underscore that point. And we're vastly running out of time. We have to finish our conversation tomorrow in the open community forum so everybody can kind of weigh in on their thoughts. One thing I just wanted to talk about is intersectionality. Like, I think we all have this. We're all dealing with several layers in some ways on this panel of whether, different identities that suffer at a disproportionate rate because of bias or discrimination. So if you're a woman, a person of color, you already have two intersectionalities that you have to deal with. And then Alicia shared that she is queer, so then she has that intersectionality to deal with, and the layering that happens in that process, really creates very complex things that you need to respond to on a day-to-day. And I just wanted to kind of give this acknowledgement and airtime, because sometimes you don't want to be responsible for somebody else, even though it might seem like the altruistic thing to do or the right thing to do to move the needle, to move the dialogue and discussion. And sometimes you just tired. Like, today I'm tired. Like, why can't people just get it? But there are these overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination and disadvantage that sometimes just wear you down. And I think, kind of to loop back to that principle of self-care and what do we do about it? Because, I think sometimes you can feel like you're drowning and you have to, and if we go back to kind of a definition that we used earlier in this session about internalizing it, like sometimes you just compartmentalize because you still have to work, you still have to provide the bills are still coming in. If you have people that you care for, loved ones, sick ones, children, however your caregivers, you still have to press forward and continue. And so just to say that there is this strange crossroads between these many layers of identities that we live with and that we pursue, and talking about, racism, bias, and discrimination. So we talked a little bit about disrupting the pattern as, our time kind of quickly runs down, but I think what I'll do is, I want to do some very practical things, and there are some key terms that I want to move to our discussion tomorrow afternoon with the rest of the community who'll have an opportunity to weigh in and talk. But if you experience an act of hate while in the community, report it to the police. Like, that is your first step. It's like, this is what you can do. In thinking about how do I respond, and instances of discrimination can be reported to CCHR, and we're going to release all of the information about how you make these reports following this webinar and a resource guide that we have. But I just want to make sure that that's clear. Like, we have these iterative conversations about how we respond and what we do and what we're processing and what these experiences are like, but there are very concrete things that you can do. And more importantly at work, because we work in an office environment, is that Real can report that too. And I think sometimes, at the beginning of the panel, there was a question about people who are unsure if they had experienced bias or discrimination or racism. And if you're unsure, you can talk to someone to help you with that, process that, particularly EEO officers at your agencies. You might turn, if you have a good relationship with your supervisor or maybe somebody, a union leader or something like that, to have those conversations. On your screen, you'll see a variety of agencies that you can actually make an official report to. And to start a claim, and we'll give you that detailed information about their URLs and telephone numbers. But we can't do anything about something we don't report, that we don't call to attention. And I think these are the sands of change that help. And the more that we can cast light on something, the more that we can find that person in the street who might have yelled at Rebecca to say this, that, and the third, to help them, report it, to help raise attention and fervor to those people who are decision makers in our workforce, but also in our communities, that this has no home here. And if we don't really talk about these things, if we don't report these things, it doesn't really give an accurate portrayal about what's happening and what's going on. And so I really just wanted to make this very clear about what to do about these things. So in our last 5 minutes, I want to go over principles of calling out, calling in, and how do you do that? And I want to move this dialogue over to our discussion tomorrow at 5 p.m. with the rest of you. So I hope everyone will join us then to do that. And really talk about anti-racism, because we're all on this journey and there's no neutrality in this conversation. Doing nothing is actually doing something. And what does anti-racism mean, and what does it look like? And then how do you become a better ally to each other, to different communities, your own community? What does allyship look like, and how do we do that? So we'll be talking about all of those things tomorrow as we continue this discussion. And in some closing thoughts, I want to thank each of the presenters who came to share very personal and sometimes very hurtful experiences. And, we can talk about them now, hindsight is 2020, but when they were happening, I'm sure that they were very impactful at the moment. Just to say that COVID-19 is here. And everyone knows that the rates at which people have contracted COVID, and then now the rates at which vaccinations are happening, very much has a racial component into it. And so if I can do anything to encourage people to continue to get tested and to continue to get vaccinated to protect your health and those who you love, I want to do that, because it's definitely important here. Resource EAP, I think somebody mentioned in this chat, racism is trauma. And trauma is, you don't have to deal with trauma alone. There are ways to process it, to manage it, to deal with it. And you can feel free to reach out to the New York City EAP to get you started on that process. And then there is a ton of resources that we've been collecting from you all, everyone who's on this webinar and everybody who's been joining us in our journey to help figure out how do we share information in ways that's meaningful. Tools and resources on this digital board that is community generated as well. So feel free to drop us some resources, but everything from ride shares for people who, ride sharing services for people who are fearful of taking the subway from AAPI Hate, to, PBS webinars about driving while Black, and what does that mean? All kinds of things in between, and all city resources from the EEO office to the EAP, all kinds of things. We're trying to warehouse them in a single source so that you could have that access to that information. And once again, please join us tomorrow, where we'll continue some of this discussion around this, and more importantly, hear from all of you. And just a quick plug, it is next month is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, and we have just confirmed that we'll be joining CCHR and a commissioners panel, commissioners who identify as API, really to talk about something bright and light, their journey to leadership and how they celebrate who they are and what they do as they lead this city in very important and distinct ways. So we encourage you to join us on May 25th for that discussion. And it's also Mental Health Awareness Month, and racism and bias and discrimination is definitely in the mental health space. And so lots of impact on substance misuse over this year. So we'll be having a conversation about that and how you get help or help those who need help for substance use. We'll be launching our first cohort on equity and inclusion. One of those things that you can do to help create a different pattern is to help build education and bridges to how exactly we do that. And we'll be having another community discussion on returning to the office for those who are coming back out of remote work, and what does that all mean, and what are your fears, what are your concerns, and how do we get you resources that you need to make that happen. And you can find all of those events on our upcoming events page. Two more things. WorkWell is doing our annual survey. Tell us how we're doing, and if we need to keep the party going, please say so. And if there are things we need to stop and revisit, please do that there. And that's also on our upcoming event page. And And finally, before we leave the month, I just wanted to just flag that, you know, April, we flagged this Green Month. Earth Day was April 22nd, and environmental impact definitely makes is different upon where you live, and communities of color, people who live in lower social economic neighborhoods definitely have different impact. Think about the Bronx and asthma prevalence. So if there are things that you can do to help improve our world and make the earth a little bit better place, we want to plant seeds with you to help us move this dialogue and this discussion. And I want to send a very special thank you to each of our panelists who've joined us today to share a little bit of themselves. We've only saw a small portion of who they are and how they engage in this conversation, but you know, we'll keep pushing through, and I hope you stay with us in this journey to also keep pushing as we look to transform, so that maybe 20 years from now, we never even use the word racism because it doesn't exist. I'm going to go there. I'm going to be really altruistic. Any closing comments from our panelists before we go? I want to leave the last words with you. Anybody? Any closing thoughts, final thoughts? No? Okay. That's okay.
Yeah. My thoughts more around, you know, self-care, you know, that, you know, always to try to consciously check in with family and friends. For a lot of people living through this panoramic, we've all become a bit isolated and disconnected. So just remembering that you have a network of people who love you and support you, and try to find that balance where you're creating time and space to receive that support.
All right, well, thank you so much. And to all of you who have joined us digitally, keep pushing through and find the support you need, even if it's with one of us. Email Workwell, we're here to support you. And thank you for your time today. Thank you so much, everyone.